Welcome, everyone. This is not just the story of a company. This is the story of two men who had nothing left, no money, no home, no hope. But from the burnt ruins of World War II, they created something that changed the world. This is the real story of Sony, the brand that brought us the Walkman, the PlayStation, the first Japanese radio, and gave the world a new vision of Japan after war. But it's not just about business. This is a story about belief, about how an idea born in a broken building can become an empire that inspires generations. And you, yes, you, will not only feel inspired. You will learn powerful life lessons. You will learn how to never give up. And most importantly, you will improve your English in the most enjoyable way. So stay till the end of this journey, because this is not a boring business story. This is a movie, and now let's begin. Part 1. Bombs, Broken Buildings, and a Big Dream. The beginning of Sony. The year was 1945. The world had just ended the most brutal war in human history, World War II. And in Tokyo, Japan, everything was destroyed. Buildings were broken. Bombs had flattened cities. Millions of people had no homes, no food, no future. Among these people were two Japanese men. One was Masaru Ibuka, an engineer. The other was Akio Morita, a physicist. They didn't have much in common. But they had one thing that made them powerful: a dream. Masaru Ibuka was always curious. As a child, he loved opening machines, radios, clocks, not to break them, but to understand them. He believed, if something already exists, it can be made better. During the war, Ibuka had worked with electronics for the Japanese army. But after Japan lost the war, he lost everything. He had no job. His city was in ruins. His future? Unknown. But instead of crying, he picked up a few tools and started building something again. Inside, a small room. Inside a damaged department store in Tokyo. That was the first spark of what would one day become Sony. That room was only 60 square meters, like a small kitchen. No fan, no heater, no windows. Just burnt bricks, broken chairs, and big dreams. Ibuka called it the Tokyo Tsushin Kenkyujo, Tokyo Telecommunications Research Institute. But let's be honest, it was just a broken room with a mad genius inside. And he started building things: radios, electrical devices, tools, machines. But he couldn't do it alone. Akio Morita was the opposite of Ibuka. Where Ibuka was quiet and technical, Morita was a visionary, a communicator, a leader. He came from a wealthy family of sake brewers. His father wanted him to run the family business, but Morita wanted more. He believed Japan could become a global symbol of innovation. He had read about Ibuka's little lab in a newspaper article. And when they met, they both knew instantly. We may be different, but together we are unstoppable. The war had just ended. Japan's economy was dead. People were hungry, homeless, hopeless. Nobody cared about electronics. Nobody believed Japan could produce good technology, not even Japanese people. But Ibuka and Morita believed something dangerous. We will not follow the world. We will lead it. They wanted to create a company unlike anything Japan had seen. Not just to make money, but to give hope to the Japanese people. Yes, the first product this now billion-dollar company ever made was a rice cooker. And it was a total failure. It burned the rice. It had no temperature control. Nobody bought it. But they didn't stop. They said, "We failed. So what? Let's try again." They kept building, testing, experimenting, until one day, They saw a new opportunity. In those days, American radios were everywhere. Japan couldn't make its own. It had no transistors, no factories, no reputation. But Ibuka had an idea. Let's make the first Japanese transistor radio. Everyone laughed. Experts said, it's impossible. The government said, we don't have the parts. America said, you can't copy our patents. But they didn't care. They worked day and night. They studied everything about radios. They used black market parts, broken pieces, leftover wires. They didn't sleep. They didn't eat properly. They were obsessed. And then, after months of sweat and struggle, they did it. They created Japan's first transistor radio. Now they had a product, but they needed a name. They didn't want a long Japanese name. They wanted something global, something easy to say, something short, something powerful. So they chose Sony. Sonus equals Latin for sound, plus Sonny equals young boy. It represented youth, energy, sound, and dreams. They said, we are not just making products. We are building a brand that the world will respect. It was the year 1955. In the heart of Tokyo, inside a tiny office with broken walls and iron shelves, a decision had been made. Sony would not remain in Japan. It was time to take their invention, a small, powerful transistor radio, and enter the most competitive market in the world, the United States of America. Akio Morita sat at his desk. He looked at the radio, held it in his hand. This little device was their hope, their courage, their future. He didn't just see a machine. He saw a bridge between war-torn Japan and the modern Western world. But now came the hardest part. He had to leave his country, travel across the ocean, and convince America, the richest country on Earth, to trust a Japanese product. Remember, this was just 10 years after World War II. The wounds of the war were still fresh. Many Americans still disliked Japanese products. Some refused to even speak with Japanese businessmen. But Morita didn't care. He believed in what they had created. He believed in Sony. So he packed one suitcase. Inside were a few clothes, a dictionary, and 2 transistor radios. He boarded the plane and whispered to himself, they don't know us yet, but one day they will. When Morita arrived in New York City, he was shocked. Massive buildings, traffic everywhere, loud music, fast-talking people. Everything was 10 times faster than Tokyo. But Morita didn't feel afraid. He felt excited. He took a small hotel room. No luxury, no comfort, just a single bed, a desk, and a dream. From that room, he began his mission, to sell the Sony radio to America. Morita started walking from company to company. He had no contacts, no scheduled meetings, no interpreter, no translator. He spoke in broken English, often using hand gestures, drawing diagrams, and pointing at his radio. Sometimes people just stared at him. Some said, sorry, we're not interested. Others laughed. Japanese radio? That won't sell here. He was rejected again and again, but rejection didn't stop him. He had walked through rubble after the war. He had seen hunger, failure, poverty. So this was nothing. Each morning he woke up, put on his suit, polished his shoes, picked up the radio, and went out again. Morita noticed something. Many American radios were big, heavy, and expensive. Sony's radio was small, light, and portable. He changed his pitch. You can carry music in your pocket. Walk with it. Travel with it. It's for the young generation. That line caught attention, especially from teenagers and music lovers. They had never seen something like this before. After weeks of struggle, he got a small opportunity. A small electronics shop agreed to take 10 units of the radio on trial. If they sold, they'd buy more. Morita personally cleaned each radio, packed it neatly, and delivered it to the shop. All 10 radios were sold in 2 days. People loved them. Young boys and girls came back asking, "Do you have more? I want one." The shop owner called Morita and said, "Give me 100 more." Soon after, a large American distributor noticed Sony's radio. They liked it. They wanted to sell it across America. But they had one condition. "We will buy thousands of your radios, but we will put our name on it. Not Sony, just our brand." To any other startup, this would sound like a dream deal. This was millions of dollars in future sales. A guaranteed entry into the US market, security, stability, success. But Morita said, no. Even though Sony was still small, even though they were desperate for money, he said, "Our name is everything. We don't just sell radios. We are building a brand that people will trust. If we remove our name today, no one will know us tomorrow." It was one of the boldest decisions in business history. And the American company, and impressed by his courage, agreed to keep the Sony name. Sony received their first large US order soon after, 100,000 transistor radios, worth over $2 million, shipped across America in waves. And guess what? They sold out in just a few months. Teenagers loved the size. Adults loved the price. Stores loved the profits. Suddenly, Sony became a name everyone wanted to know. Morita decided it was time. Sony would now have an office in the US. He rented a tiny room in New York City. One desk, one phone, one assistant. But it was Sony's first global step. He worked day and night, answering calls, managing orders, building relationships. Back in Tokyo, Masaru Ibuka handled production. He expanded their small factory, hired more workers, improved quality. Together, they built a bridge between Tokyo and New York, a connection that would help Sony grow from a startup to a global giant. But Morita wasn't satisfied. He said, "We must not become lazy. One good product is not enough. We must create something the world has never seen." Sony's engineers were challenged to do more. Better sound, smaller size, longer battery, new ideas. Part 2. They said it was useless. But it changed the world. The year was 1979. Sony was no longer just a small company. It was now a rising name across the globe. People were starting to say, "Have you heard of that Japanese brand? Sony? Their radios are amazing." But inside Sony's Tokyo headquarters, Akio Morita was restless. He had seen success. He had opened an office in America. They had made millions of dollars in radio sales. But now, he was looking for what's next. He knew the truth. If we don't create something new, we'll become history. Sony was making TVs, recorders, audio devices, but none of it felt revolutionary anymore. Morita wanted to do something unbelievable, something no one else had done. One day, one of Sony's engineers, Norio Oga, came with a complaint. He loved listening to classical music, but he hated carrying big cassette players while traveling. He told Morita, "Why don't we build a small cassette player, just for headphones, no speakers, no record button, just music, just listening?" Morita paused. A cassette player with no speakers? No ability to record music? To many people, that sounded useless. Even inside Sony, many executives laughed. They said, "Why would anyone carry a device that can only play music and nothing else? And who wants to wear headphones while walking? People want big sound, not private sound." But Morita saw something different. He didn't just see a machine. He saw a new lifestyle. He imagined a young person walking through the city, music in their ears, lost in their own world. He imagined people listening privately on a train, in the park, in their rooms. This wasn't just about music. It was about freedom. So Marita said, "Let's do it." Sony's engineers got to work. They started with their existing cassette recorder. They removed the recording system, the loudspeaker, the microphone, and replaced it with a stereo amplifier, a headphone jack, lightweight materials. They tested dozens of sizes, shapes, buttons. The challenge was, it must be small enough to fit in your hand, light enough to carry anywhere, and strong enough to survive daily use. After months of trials, they created the first prototype. It was small, battery-powered, crystal clear in sound, fit perfectly in a pocket or bag. Marita wanted a name that felt fun, light, and modern. They considered Soundabout in the US, Stowaway in the UK, Freestyle in other countries. But finally, they went back to something simpler. Walkman. It wasn't perfect English, but it sounded cool. It combined walk, movement, portability, man, person, individual user. And Marita believed the name would grow with the product. They printed the first batch, 30,000 Walkman units, packaged neatly, sold for around $150 at launch. They sent them to music stores in Japan and waited. At first, no one bought them. People walked past the product. Even journalists mocked it. One newspaper headline said, "Sony's Walkman, a step backwards in music." Sony executives panicked. They had invested millions of dollars into the idea. Was it a mistake? Marita didn't panic. He said, "People don't understand the Walkman because they've never seen anyone use it." So he launched a radical marketing plan. Sony hired young models and actors, gave them free Walkman players, and sent them to parks, subways, beaches, college campuses. They wore bright clothes, danced, smiled, and used the Walkman in public. Passers-by noticed. They saw people walking with music in their ears. They looked happy, stylish, cool. Suddenly, Walkman became a trend. People wanted to feel what these people were feeling. And within 2 months, Sony sold out all 30,000 Walkmans. Orders came from every direction: Europe, USA, Canada, Australia, Asia. Sony couldn't keep up with the demand. By the end of the first year, Sony had sold over 500,000 units. Within 5 years, they sold over 10 million Walkmans worldwide. Eventually, the number would grow to over 400 million Walkmans sold, generating billions of dollars in revenue. But more than money, Sony had done something no other company had done before. They had changed human behavior. Before the Walkman, music was shared in rooms, played on speakers. You couldn't listen privately. Music was for groups, not individuals. After the Walkman, people walked, jogged, traveled with music. Music became personal. Headphones became a fashion. The idea of my playlist, my world was born. Sony had invented personal music. Today, when you use Spotify, or put on earbuds, or create your own playlist, it all started with that one invention, the Walkman. Now, Sony wasn't just a company that made electronics. It was a brand that stood for innovation, independence, youth, culture, personal identity. People didn't just want Sony products. They wanted to be part of Sony's world. And Marita? He became a global icon. He was invited to business conferences, universities, innovation forums. People started calling him the Steve Jobs of Japan. Sony was flying high. The Walkman had changed the world. It was not just a product. It had become a symbol of culture. People walked with it, danced with it, lived with it. Sony had become a global brand, rich, respected, and rising. But Marita and the team were not resting. They had already changed the way people listen to music. Now they wanted to change the way people play. They wanted to enter a new battlefield, the world of video games. Why video games? In the early 1990s, gaming was becoming more than just a toy. Children loved it, teenagers were addicted, and a new industry was being born, one that would soon be worth billions of dollars. Companies like Nintendo and Sega were leading, but Sony had never made a video game console. Many inside the company thought it was too risky. They said, "We make music players and TVs. We don't belong in gaming." But one young engineer inside Sony didn't agree. His name was Ken Kutaragi. Ken was a quiet genius. He loved games, he loved technology, and most of all, he loved pushing limits. He watched his daughter play Nintendo games and thought to himself, what if we make something better? What if we make a gaming system so powerful that people feel like they're inside the game? At the time, he was just an engineer, not a leader, not a decision maker. But he had a dream, and he had an idea. Sony didn't want to jump into gaming alone, so they went to Nintendo, the king of the gaming world at the time, and together they made a deal. The plan was, Nintendo would make a new console. Sony would help build the CD-ROM system inside it. This would allow games to be played from discs, not cartridges. Sony would also make a version of their own called PlayStation. It seemed like the perfect partnership. They started working. They built prototypes. Millions of dollars were spent. Then came the big announcement day. 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. Sony executives arrived. They prepared the stage. They were ready to tell the world, Sony and Nintendo, together we're creating the future of gaming. But what happened next was a brutal betrayal. Just hours before Sony's big reveal, Nintendo went on stage and announced something shocking. We are now partnering with Philips, not Sony, for our next console. Sony executives were sitting in the audience. Their jaws dropped. The company they trusted, worked with, built for, had cut them off publicly, without warning. It was not just a business betrayal. It was a slap in the face. Millions of dollars lost, months of work thrown away, and worst of all, the entire industry watched Sony get humiliated. Most companies would walk away, but not Sony. Ken Kutaragi walked into the meeting room. He looked at the team. Everyone was silent, angry, embarrassed. He said, "Let's not fight them with words. Let's fight them with power. Let's build our own console, and let's make it the greatest console the world has ever seen." The room was quiet. Then someone whispered, "Let's do it." That moment was the birth of the Sony PlayStation. Sony gave Ken the green light, but with one condition. This must be different, not just a toy. It must be a full entertainment machine. Ken and his team worked like mad scientists. They built and rebuilt the console again and again. They focused on 3D graphics, fast processing speed, CD-ROM game loading, memory cards, epic sound quality. They didn't want to copy Nintendo. They wanted to destroy the old way of gaming. Finally, in December 1994, Sony launched the first PlayStation in Japan. Price: $299 US. Design: sleek, gray, simple. Controller: comfortable, easy to use. Graphics: revolutionary. And the result? It sold out in hours. People lined up in the snow, in the rain, to get one. Stores couldn't keep up with the demand. And then, Sony took it global. In 1995, PlayStation launched in North America, Europe, Australia. Sony didn't just sell a console, they sold a new experience. The ads said, "Live in your world, play in ours." The PlayStation allowed gamers to play longer games, watch real cutscenes, save progress, feel like they were part of a movie. It was fun, serious, and addictive. Kids loved it. Teenagers loved it. Even adults got hooked. Over 100 million units of the original PlayStation sold worldwide. Games like Tekken, Final Fantasy VII, and Metal Gear Solid became global hits. Sony made over $60 billion in PlayStation-related revenue over the years. By 2000, Sony had officially defeated Nintendo in global console sales. What started as a betrayal turned into the greatest revenge success story in gaming history. Most companies would have given up, but Sony turned anger into action, rejection into reinvention, betrayal into billion-dollar business. And all of it happened because of one betrayed deal, one quiet genius, one team that refused to quit. The PlayStation was no longer just a product. It became a movement. And Sony? Now, it wasn't just an electronics company. It was a global entertainment empire. Part 3. From game console to global stage, Sony becomes an entertainment empire. The PlayStation was not just a win. It was a revolution. Sony had entered the gaming world as outsiders. They had been betrayed, rejected, humiliated. But now, they were the leaders. They had already sold over 100 million PlayStations. The world loved Sony, and the world was ready for more. But deep inside Sony's Tokyo office, their top leaders were not celebrating. They were planning something bigger. Akio Morita had once said, "We are not a company that copies others. We are a company that creates the future." And that future was not just electronics. Sony was about to enter a completely different universe: movies, music, media, magic. By the late 1990s, the world was changing again. People weren't just buying gadgets. They were watching movies, listening to CDs, playing 3D games, watching animated films, falling in love with stories. And Sony had a dream. Why should we only build the machine? Let's also control what goes inside the machine. They realized something powerful. If you own the device, you can make money. But if you also own the content, you can build a kingdom. So Sony made a bold, dangerous, and brilliant move. They decided to buy Hollywood. In 1989, Sony shocked the world by buying Columbia Pictures, one of the most famous movie studios in America. Price? $3.4 billion. The world laughed. Critics said, "Why is a Japanese electronics company buying a movie studio? They don't know Hollywood. They will fail." Even some Sony employees were scared. It was a huge risk. But Sony didn't care. They didn't just want to sell TVs. They wanted to create what people watched on those TVs. So they took control of Columbia and stepped into a world full of actors, directors, scriptwriters, awards, box office battles. Sony was now in the movie business. At first, Sony struggled. They made a few movies that failed. They lost millions. Hollywood laughed again. But Sony didn't quit. They learned. They adapted. They studied what people loved. And soon, they started producing blockbusters: Men in Black, Spider-Man, Jumanji, Bad Boys, The Karate Kid remake, The Da Vinci Code, The Equalizer. These films didn't just earn money. They became part of pop culture. They built emotional connections. They gave people heroes, stories, and dreams. By the mid-2000s, Sony Pictures had become one of the top 5 movie studios in the world. Their films earned billions of dollars at the global box office. But Sony didn't stop with movies. They moved even deeper into music. They already had a small music division. But now, they wanted to dominate. So they merged and grew into Sony Music Entertainment, one of the largest record labels in the world. And they signed some of the biggest artists in history: Michael Jackson, Beyoncé, Adele, Shakira, Justin Timberlake, Harry Styles, Miley Cyrus, Travis Scott, and many more. Sony was no longer just an electronics brand. They were now shaping the music people loved, the movies people watched, the games people played. They were building a world of emotion, one song, one story at a time. Imagine this. A person wakes up. They turn on their Sony TV, watch a Sony Pictures movie, play a song from Sony Music, pick up their Sony PlayStation controller. Game starts with a Sony soundtrack. Save progress on Sony memory card. Sony had done the impossible. They were now present in your eyes, your ears, your hands, your heart. And they weren't just selling products. They were crafting experiences. Even with all their success, Sony never became lazy. They kept experimenting. They built Blu-ray disc technology, high-definition TVs, professional cameras used in Hollywood, noise-canceling headphones, robotic dog Aibo, virtual reality PlayStation VR, smartphones with 4K screens. They also invested heavily in AI, robotics, and digital imaging. Sony believed, if people laugh at your idea today, they will thank you tomorrow. That mindset built their empire. By now, Sony had over 110,000 employees worldwide, offices in more than 180 countries, revenue of over $85 billion per year, multiple billion-dollar divisions, gaming, music, films, imaging, electronics. But more than numbers. Sony had built a name that meant creativity, quality, emotion, respect. And they did it not by copying others, but by leading, again and again. Sony's success didn't come from just machines. It came from their culture. Inside Sony, every employee is taught to think like an artist, work like an engineer, lead like an entrepreneur, care like a family member. They give their people freedom to experiment, permission to fail, opportunities to grow. It's not just a job, it's a mission to improve lives through creativity and technology. Now Sony is working on next-gen PlayStation 6, smart wearable music tech, film studios in new countries, global music talent expansion, virtual production for films, AI-driven sound and editing tools, gaming universes mixed with film and music. They're creating a future where one story can be a game, a movie, and a song, all at once, all powered by Sony. They are building worlds, not just products. Part 4. The legacy of Sony, built on courage, cracks, and a camera of dreams. Sony had now become something bigger than a company. They were a storyteller, a builder, a connector, a symbol. They had entered every part of the world, and every part of the human heart, from the streets of Tokyo to the skyscrapers of New York, from the hands of children playing PlayStation, to the ears of teenagers wearing headphones on buses, to the eyes of movie lovers crying in dark theaters. Sony was everywhere. But behind all the cameras, screens, music, and machines was a truth most people didn't see. And today, in this final chapter, you will see it. Sony's success was not made from shiny gadgets. It was built from broken floors, rejected ideas, burnt buildings, sleepless nights, empty bank accounts, and tears no one saw. Masaru Ibuka started alone in a burned-out department store, with only tools and belief. Akio Morita traveled to a country that hated his language and sold a dream through hand gestures. Ken Kutaragi got rejected, pushed aside, and laughed at, but built PlayStation with anger in his heart and fire in his soul. They didn't have luck. They didn't have comfort. They didn't have safety. But they had something more dangerous. They refused to stop. Sony's cameras didn't just capture pictures. They captured moments. Sony's games didn't just give fun. They gave escape. They gave courage. They gave another chance to the broken kid who felt like a loser. Sony's music wasn't just sound. It was healing. They didn't create machines. They created meaning. And that's what made them different. Now let's talk about what most people don't know. Akio Morita, the face of Sony, gave his whole life to the company. He believed in global peace through global creativity. He didn't want Sony to be Japanese. He wanted it to be human. In 1993, after a long career, Morita had a stroke. He was forced to retire. He couldn't speak clearly. He couldn't lead anymore. The man who once stood on world stages was now quiet in a hospital bed. But until his last breath, he still read Sony reports, tracked news, and smiled when the company succeeded. In 1999, Akio Morita passed away. He didn't live to see the full future of the PlayStation 2 or Spider-Man's billion-dollar empire. But he died with one truth inside his chest. I gave everything, and now the world listens when we speak. As Sony grew into a giant, something else quietly grew too. Pressure, competition, pain. In the 2010s, Apple, Samsung, and other giants began dominating the phone and gadget world. Sony's smartphone sales began to fall. They couldn't compete in the mobile wars. They shut down stores. They laid off employees. Some people started saying, Sony is not what it used to be. The same company that once changed music and movies was now losing ground in tech. It was painful. It was heartbreaking. Even loyal fans started to walk away. But Sony didn't quit. They went back to their roots. Sony began to refocus. They doubled down on PlayStation. They improved their cameras, now used in most iPhones. They pushed deeper into music and film. They invested in sensors, AI, and cinematic technology. They didn't try to beat the world in every category. They chose to own what they were born to own: emotion, vision, experience. And that brought them back to the top. Today, Sony is one of the top 5 biggest media companies in the world, makes over $90 billion every year, owns Sony Pictures, Sony Music, Sony Interactive Entertainment, PlayStation, sells to over 190 countries, creates movies, music, cameras, TVs, and world-class gaming experiences, is behind many songs you hear, games you play, and films you love. But more importantly, they are a symbol. Final life lessons from Sony's story. 1. You don't need everything to start. Sony started after war. They had no money, no building, no support, but they had a dream. And that was enough. 2. If they reject you, rebuild yourself. Sony was betrayed by Nintendo, but instead of crying, they created the PlayStation. That betrayal made them billionaires. 3. Never put your name down for money. Sony refused to sell their radio without the Sony name. That decision built a global brand. Always protect your name, your values, your vision. Nelias fail. Try again, then fly. Sony's first rice cooker failed. Their phones didn't succeed. Some movies flopped, but they always came back stronger. Failure is part of every success story. 5. Lead with emotion, not just machines. Sony didn't just build technology. They built experiences, music, games, and moments that made people feel alive. That's what made them different. 6. Protect your originality. Sony didn't copy, they created. The first Japanese radio, the Walkman, the PlayStation. They made what never existed before. Do the same in your life. Annual revenue, over 90 billion US dollars. Market value, over 110 billion US dollars. PlayStation alone, worth 45 plus billion US dollars. Sony Music plus Sony Pictures, combined worth 25 plus billion US dollars. Total employees, more than 110,000 worldwide. From one burnt room to a company richer than 90% of the countries on Earth. Sony is not just a success story, it's a miracle made by belief. If Sony taught us one thing, it's that your start does not decide your finish. You can start in pain. You can start in silence. You can start with empty hands. But if your dream is strong, you can still reach the stars. So please, never give up. Protect your name. Do what others think is impossible. And build something that makes people feel something, just like Sony did. If this story touched your heart, if it inspired your soul, if it improved your English, then please, subscribe to this channel, because more powerful stories are coming, and I want you to grow with every one of them. Comment below your favorite part of the Sony story. Share this video with someone who needs to believe in their dream again. And remember, you don't need permission to become great. If Sony can do it, so can you.